With the recent release and immense success of the Resident Evil 4 remake, everyone was reintroduced to the original implementation of the popular Attache Case, an aspect of the gameplay that represented only a tiny fraction of the overall experience, but left such an impression over the years since the launch of the original game that people have been clamoring for its return ever since. As beloved as the system is, it's only one part of the journey that is the evolution of inventory management within the Resident Evil franchise. Obviously, strict inventory management is not a mechanic that's exclusive to this series, or even to the survival horror genre. RPGs have their own form of limited inventory space fairly often, usually as weight limitations, but some may use a grid-like system of their own too. But for the sake of focus, this video is going to be dedicated only to the Resident Evil series and how the system has changed from game to game, and how they impact the player's subjective experience. In 1996, Resident Evil graced the world with its release on the PlayStation 1, debuting as a bestseller in Japan, North America, and all of Europe. With 4 million copies in the hands of players by the end of 1997, it was not only a smash hit, but it helped sell PlayStation consoles too. It has gone down in history as one of the most influential games of all time and is credited with popularizing and defining the survival horror experience as we know it. While the story and dialogue were regarded as laughable at best, it was the gameplay experience that made its mark on people. It was a tightly paced game with thick atmosphere, a creepy soundtrack, engaging puzzles, meaningful exploration, threatening combat, and of course, strict limitations on inventory to help drive home the tension and sense of helplessness. And to make things even more interesting, the game offered differing levels of strictness depending on who you played. Jill Valentine has a total of 8 inventory slots, while Chris Redfield has 6. This is almost universally considered to be the biggest reason as to why Chris is the harder character to play. But there's a few more differences than that, especially when playing the remake on the GameCube. But regardless of which character you play, that item limitation is always there. For anyone who is unfamiliar with the series and perhaps the genre at large, they might wonder, what purpose does this hard and fast restriction serve? It may appear like an arbitrary mechanic meant to incite frustration, but it's much more than that. It's a major contributor not only to immersion, but to the delivery on the promise that's given by the genre name, survival horror. I've already more or less gone over this topic in my What is Survival Horror video from a couple years back, but for the sake of convenience, I'll go over it here once more, but in a more abbreviated manner. What does the word survival mean within the context of gameplay? Thematically speaking, any horror game is about surviving amidst a chaotic and unpredictable setting filled with monsters or undead looking to devour you. But how is the essence of survival translated through gameplay mechanics? It's actually pretty simple. Survival means choice, and not just one or two scattered throughout the game, but making continual choices on a moment-to-moment basis. One of those continual choices comes in the form of item management. In Resident Evil, everything you pick up takes up one of those precious few slots in your inventory. Weapons are a no-brainer. You always need a means to defend yourself against these shambling foes. It's easy to think you can hoard as much ammo as you can, and that's assuming you can find that much. But what about healing items beyond that? Wouldn't you want at least one first aid spray just in case? And what about a second weapon, like a shotgun, for stronger enemies or bosses, or in case you run out of ammo for the handgun? Then you would need space for a stack of shotgun shells. And what about key items? In Resident Evil 1 and its remake, keys take up space in your regular inventory too. And sometimes you need to hold multiple keys at once if you want to make things efficient. Now all of a sudden Jill's 8 item slots are full and you don't have the space to pick up this green herb you just found. So now you have to run back to an item box to deposit something, but you don't know what. If you're playing the remake, you might have left some zombies lying on the floor because you decided to not carry the lighter around with you, so if you make the round trip to an item box and back, one of them might turn into a crimson head on the way. Oh shit, now you've stumbled upon another key item for a different puzzle you haven't even begun yet. Should you make room for that too? Or should you put it in the item box? What if the puzzle's somewhere close by? If you leave it sitting there, you might forget it, and what if it's for something optional but helpful? God damn, you just entered a new corridor or room that has multiple other entrances, but it has enemies in it. It seems like an important area that you'll re-enter many times, but you're not sure. Should you spend the ammo clearing the zombies out, or run past them and risk getting grabbed? So on and so forth, these are the moment-to-moment decisions you make in your first playthrough, and they're impactful because of the strict inventory capacity. They make management of your resources crucial, and you are rewarded for your good instincts and understanding of mechanics with easy passage to the next important room and easy backtracking. Or you're punished for bad decisions with increased challenges, leading to wasted ammo or heals. Resident Evil games often, if not always, encourage optimization, allowing for a remarkable amount of open-endedness to achieve it. And the inventory management is one of, if not the, biggest contributors to this design. It's the linchpin holding much of it together. Imagine how much less engrossing the gameplay experience would be if you could just hoard everything you picked up and didn't need to venture back to an item box. There would be no tough choices between holding a healing item or simply holding more ammo. No tension when entering a room for the first time because you don't know if you have the resources to endure a fight that might be waiting inside. No sacrifices by placing more resources away so you can carry multiple puzzle pieces to finish it faster. Big and small, these are all choices facilitated by strict item limits, and they represent the survival part of survival horror. From the first game onward, this system stayed more or less the same. Characters had limited item slots, and frequent use of the item box was necessary so that resources didn't go ignored. The existence of the item box was a small blessing that some people probably didn't truly appreciate at first, because it seemed like a no-brainer mechanic to have. A magical wormhole container that shared its contents with all other item boxes scattered around the map, so you didn't need to backtrack an ungodly amount of distance to pick up something you deposited hours ago. It was extremely convenient and prevented any sort of undue alienation of the more casual players. The Resident Evil remake for GameCube would actually add a real survival difficulty where auto-aim was turned off and item boxes were no longer connected, meaning that being intimately familiar with enemy and item placement was mandatory so you wouldn't have an aggravating experience where countless minutes are wasted going back and forth between specific boxes. It's a mode that's really only appealing to the most dedicated and hardcore fans, but if you enjoy it, it may be the only way you play from then on. I discuss the item box now because in November 2002, it would be subjected to an unfortunate removal from the newest game at the time, much to the chagrin of many players. Resident Evil 0, a prequel that takes place before the events of the first game. 0 was a bit of an oddball in more ways than one. First, you were able to control two characters in the same campaign and switch between them on the fly. You could travel individually or as a unit, and whichever character you weren't controlling would be taken over by a rather simplistic AI that still managed to do its job well enough. The good news is, two characters traveling together means double the item slots. When wandering around as a pair, you had access to 12 slots, with each character, Rebecca and Billy, having 6. It was up to you if you wanted to actually give the AI-controlled character a weapon or just keep them around as an unarmed pack mule, but keep in mind, they wouldn't be with you 100% of the time. Plus, some weapons took up 2 slots instead of 1. Second, going back to the subject of the item box, it was taken out for 0 and replaced with a more realistic storage system, which was simply dropping items on the floor. Yeah, just dropping them on the floor where they will sit forever until you decide to pick them back up again. It was a little odd, but didn't take too long to get used to. But as you might imagine, this meant that if you needed an item you dropped, you had to go to the exact room you left it in to pick it back up. No magical wormholes here. For most people, especially those who lean closer to the casual side of the fanbase, this may sound like a chore, and for a lot, it was. It felt like needless playtime padding and served as little more than a tedious extra step or two in a process that was working just fine in the remake that came out earlier. Granted, it wasn't as bad as it could have been thanks to how the game was structured. It took place in 2 locations: a train, which was obviously a very linear area with only a handful of rooms, and a facility that was thankfully not as big as the famous Spencer estate. But the system still had its fair share of shortcomings. In addition to the dull extra step of needing to go to specific rooms, there was actually a limit to how many items you can place in each room, and it wasn't a big one. In the main foyer of the facility, you can only drop about 8 to 10 items before you're forced to use another room for storage. And no, the second floor does not count as a separate room. Another frustrating problem was that there was no menu that listed the items currently dropped in the room. If you wanted to pick something up, you had to position one of the characters near it and interact. This was a problem because it basically forced you to drop everything fairly close to each other for convenience, but if you unfortunately placed multiple items too close to each other, you now found yourself bumbling around with your positioning in order to pick up the right one. The fact that the game had the classic static camera angles did not help. I understand why the development team chose this kind of storage system. It's easier to accept as realistic and immersive. The idea would end up working for the more hardcore players who love extra limitations for those very reasons. But for everyone else, it just took a mechanic that was working perfectly fine and added unnecessary and time-consuming new rules that ultimately led to the same functional result, but with staggeringly less efficiency. If there's one almost universal truth that I have discovered in my many years of playing video games, it's this: everyone appreciates immersion until it comes at the cost of convenience. Because nothing interrupts immersion faster than annoyance at a mechanic or lack of a mechanic that turns a simple task into a chore. While the concept of just dropping items where you stood was interesting on paper, the various limitations and complete removal of item boxes were ill-fated decisions that worked against the greater vision. Not that Zero needed a ton of boxes scattered around everywhere, maybe just 2 or 3 in key rooms that were designed for frequent revisits. As it stands, the item drop system would end up never returning to the mainline games again after this. However, Zero would be followed just over 2 years later by another game that did not have item boxes, but this time its inventory system would be much better received by players. Resident Evil 4 featured the beloved Attache Case, a unique type of inventory that placed all of your usable items and weapons on a grid of squares, and the player needed to manually rearrange its contents to make room for more. As I mentioned, the game had no item boxes to speak of, and no, you could not drop items on the ground to pick up later. This meant that all you had was what you could carry. Sounds like a nightmare at first, but the game offered regular case upgrades to increase its size by significant amounts, with the final case being large enough to comfortably house 3 to 4 weapons, several healing items and grenades, and plenty of ammo for each gun. What's also great is the fact that key items and treasures did not take up space in the case. They had their own tab, and you could carry as much as you wanted, leaving the case entirely for usable gear. It was an excellent inventory system that perfectly complemented the more action-focused gameplay and more linear map design. If there was any downside to speak of, it was the fact that owning all weapons at once was now impractical, if not impossible. But what really grabbed people about the Attache Case was the simple fact that it was actually fun to engage with. As it turns out, most people actually love manually rearranging things on a grid, both to make more room so more things can fit, and to organize and group items together in a way that they find to be personally pleasing. This shouldn't be a surprise, I guess, considering the popularity of Tetris, and the Attache Case was basically inventory Tetris. Every time you opened the inventory screen with the intention of sorting things around, a new game started, and it was instantly engrossing. Limited inventory space was previously a passive limitation that was constantly looming over the player, but now it was a gripping activity you could opt into at any second. The game basically made a mini-game out of its own inventory screen, and it shockingly never felt like a chore, because not only was it brief and mentally stimulating in its own right, it also served a purpose that helped the player. Thus, it was never a waste of time. Space in your attache case was always important, and so the 10 to 60 seconds of effort in making that space was always justified. In fact, the attache case system is so popular, it eventually spawned indie games that implemented it themselves. In at least one case, one puzzle game revolved entirely around it. I reviewed it, actually, and I loved it. It's called Save Room, and I recommend checking it out. Sadly, the attache case would not be seen again for quite some time. Resident Evil 5 would actually adopt a system closer to Zero because, once again, the player had an AI-controlled partner, and this time both Chris and Sheva had 9 slots, with weapons taking up only 1. Thankfully, item dropping did not come back, and instead, due to the very linear structure of the game, there was an item box you could access between chapters or whenever you loaded from a checkpoint. RE5's system was simple, straightforward, and easy to read, even if it wasn't a cool minigame in itself like the attache case was. It allowed for quick and painless trading of items between characters, especially when playing co-op with another player. In fact, I think it's fair to say that if the inventory system of 5 were even the slightest bit more cumbersome, it would impact its reception by fans fairly dramatically, because trading with your partner was a task that was important and constantly needed to be done for efficient item management. Resident Evil 6's inventory screen was also pretty unique. Not only did it open in real time, meaning the gameplay did not pause when it was up, but you could still control your characters while navigating it. Furthermore, it had enough space to carry all weapons in whichever campaign you were playing, but it had limited space for consumables like ammo and healing items. However, 6's inventory screen is probably considered the most bothersome to use, and because of the game's heavy action focus, actual inventory management did not exist in the same gameplay-altering way it did in previous games. And then the RE Engine games started to come out, beginning with Resident Evil 7. It brought things back to basics by having a simple and no-nonsense inventory screen comparable to classic games. But there was the added mechanic of finding backpacks scattered around the map, which permanently increased your inventory space with each one you found. These were huge rewards for exploration and made it very important to scrape the map and do every single puzzle. The Resident Evil 2 and 3 remakes also adopted this system. And then, after 16 long years of waiting, Resident Evil Village finally brought back the beloved attache case. It functioned essentially the same as it did in 4, but this time with more crafting options. And just like 4, there were no item boxes either. I will say though, I feel like I didn't need to open and rearrange the case in Village as often as I did in 4, but maybe that's just me. And finally, just a few weeks ago, the Resident Evil 4 remake brought back the original attache case in all its glory, now with its own perks and equipable charms to offer passive buffs like increased drop rates for specific items, or a chance at increasing the number of crafted ammunition. The circle of Resident Evil inventory systems completed 2 full cycles, and now we wait and see what the next game is going to be like. If it's another remake, then we'll probably have an idea of what to expect, but if it's a new title, then it could be up in the air. Whether it's the strict passiveness of the original type that encouraged constant decision-making, or the active involvement of something like the attache case, inventory management has been crucial to many experiences within the franchise. It would be nice to see the trend continue. This concludes my thoughts on inventory management systems within the Resident Evil series. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you around.